So Ireland's climate law provides for the government to consult the public when it's creating annual climate action plans, um, drawing up the carbon budgets, and in the creation of long-term climate action strategies. Um, the provisions aren't very strong. It says that the government shall consult where the minister considers appropriate. That language could really be made a lot tighter. So, for example, Scotland's climate legislation require the government to produce a public engagement strategy showing how people are going to be consulted and when, and showing how that consultancy is going to be made meaningful and actually include people in a way that isn't sort of perceived as a box ticking mechanism.
I think those provisions in the revised Irish climate law passed last year are relatively limited in scope. There isn't a whole lot around public participation. I don't think we need to fit everything on climate change into one piece of legislation. So there is quite a bit of other stuff happening around public participation in formulating climate policy here in Ireland. That's not included in the law. So the fact that there isn't much in the law isn't necessarily an indication that there isn't much public participation in climate policy.
The provisions for public participation in our new amended law are not very wholesome, and they are restricted to local government measures to some extent. However, I'm not sure that it is the role of this law, or indeed the role of the state, to encourage public participation in this area. As an example, where we're speaking from is in a Docklands community in Dublin, and I know there are a lot of community initiatives going on here in terms of cooperative activism and so on, which aren't necessarily aided by the state or facilitated by the state. So in fact, they're frustrated by them in many instances. So therefore, the expectation that there should be a provision for public participation in a framework law like this may not be the right one.
If other countries are looking for models for public participation, I'm not sure Ireland's climate law is the place to look. I think there are interesting and important initiatives in Ireland. We had a citizens' assembly on climate change. We're having a citizens' assembly on biodiversity loss that's ongoing, and also in parallel a children and young people's assembly on biodiversity loss. So I think Ireland is doing interesting stuff in this space, but it's not embodied in the climate law.
Climate Act is a really important way to ensure public participation on climate policy because it's through the act that you have, it's through the legislation that policy flows. So the legislation is what provides for climate action plans that are updated on an annual basis. The government consults the public every time that happens. It consults the public on the formation of the carbon budget programme, and also in the development of a long-term climate action strategy. So if that isn't provided for through the legislation, there's a risk that governments could just produce climate policy without consulting people who are most impacted, without opening it up to public consultation at all, actually. So there's certainly a way to make that language stronger.
So the formal provisions in the climate law for public participation are okay. There are requirements for public consultation at certain times, but they're not terribly prescriptive. And obviously a lot of that then will depend on how well the state actually does consultation of participation. And we know there's great variety between different departments, different governments as to how that's done. And so far that's been mixed. Hopefully it'll improve. We've only had 1.5 years of that process so far. But I actually think the bigger impact is on the overall public square with regard to climate policy, because the law brings climate policy far more, I think, to the open and centre of public policy making. And so there's now moments where the government has to make decisions, where the parliament has to make decisions, or where the climate council is issuing reports, and they provide far more hopes for media debate and public engagement than ever before. We've definitely been seeing those effects. For example, when the government was deciding on the targets for each individual sector, that produced more debate on climate policy than any other time in history.